This is Journey to Chinese Fluency podcast, episode number 26.
Embarrassing moment, culture insights, proven methods to achieve Chinese fluency. Skip that learning curve with the Journey to Chinese Fluency podcast. Now, your host, Victor Yang.
Hello everyone, Victor Yang here and welcome to Journey to Chinese Fluency. Today I am joined by Andreas Goller. Andreas is from Germany and he speaks German natively. Apart from speaking fluent English and Chinese, he also speaks rusty fluent French, intermediate Thai, and some basic Japanese and Korean. So that's 7 languages. Andreas has studied Chinese for 8 years and he now lives in Guangzhou, China. He is now 27 years old, working as a project manager at the German Chamber of Commerce. And here's one very, very interesting fact. He once traveled from Singapore to Germany via land. You know what? I don't even know that you can actually travel via land from Singapore to Asia. That's very, very interesting to me. I looked this up on the map. Yeah, actually it's possible. So anyway, let's welcome our guest. 你好, Andreas. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Victor.
Well, are you ready to share with us your journey to Chinese fluency?
Absolutely. That's what I'm here for. Try my best.
Awesome. Let's do this. Well, first of all, please feel free to share with us a bit more about your introduction, your background.
My background is, as you already mentioned, I am from Germany and I studied Chinese for my undergrad, the inspiration for which I got during a trip to China after high school. At the time, I was doing a year of social service at a school in Thailand. And right after I arrived, we had a month off. And I figured I got a month off. So, I should travel to a big country where I can spend a whole month. So I decided on going to China. I didn't know any Chinese at the time, but there was a really cheap flight from Bangkok to Macau. So I flew to Macau, went to Hong Kong, and then entered mainland China. Actually, Guangzhou was my first stop at the time. That was 2009. It was very different from today. And I traveled to Xiamen, where I ended up studying my master's degree. So that left a very good impression on me. Obviously, I'm retracing my steps from that first trip somehow. Went to Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing, and Yichang in Hubei province,
Right.
where I really wanted to see the Three Gorges Dam. That was my big, that was something I was really interested in high school. And I took a trip on a boat from Yichang to Chongqing. All wasn't very easy because, as I said, I didn't speak any Chinese at the time. I didn't have any contact with Chinese culture, but I found Chinese people to be very helpful. And it's just kind of like people know you're a foreigner and you're kind of lost, and people just very proactively come up to you and try to help. And I was very impressed with the general hospitality of Chinese people, and also with how little I knew about China. Like, you read about China on the news, but it's all very abstract. It's all political or economical. You don't really get a sense as a Westerner, I feel, of how Chinese people live. And I became aware of that during my first trip to China. And I was like, a lot of Chinese people speak English and know about much of the Western world, but even me, who was relatively interested in East Asia, I had absolutely no idea of what life looks like in China. So I figured, there needs to be not just Chinese who learn about Western culture and language, but Westerners who learn about Chinese language and culture. And that's kind of what I set out to do.
Right. That's very interesting. So when did you take the trip? Did you take the trip before you go to study Chinese in university?
Yeah, the trip was kind of my inspiration in the end. Before the trip, I had no intention to be studying Chinese, actually. When I came here, I was just very impressed with everything that's happening in China, and was made aware of how little I knew about what life is like in China. So I ended up deciding, I want to study Chinese and be able to study it full time, because I thought Chinese is a language that requires that kind of time commitment.
Right. So you just went traveling in China and you got interested in the Chinese language and the culture and the people, and then you went back to Germany and started learning Chinese in university. Is that what happened?
That's right.
Wow, that's interesting. So during your study of Chinese, what has been your biggest motivation?
We had the university where I studied, Heidelberg University in Germany. They have a pretty good Chinese language program. What's special about it is that they pretty much put all the Chinese language courses into a very intense first year. So the first 2 semesters, you're pretty much occupied just studying Chinese. We had a schedule of having to memorize 150 characters every week, being able to actively write them. So that 150 new characters every week. So it's very fast paced, and you really needed to commit to be able to pass the first year. So that motivation came very natural. It was simply the requirement of the course. And I feel very fortunate because I think Chinese is a language best learned in an intensive, short amount of time. I think if you can study Chinese over 5 years, taking 1 or 2 evening classes every week, but I think it's a lot more efficient if you, really dedicate a certain amount of time. You come to China to go to language school and really immerse, because I think that's really what it takes as a Westerner to study a language as foreign as Chinese. Anyway, that was my experience.
Yeah, I think you have raised a very good point. I guess learning a language, especially at the beginning, is the most difficult part because it takes quite a bit of vocabulary and, just getting your head around things to be able to make basic communication, basic conversations. Once you pass that stage, it gets much, much easier to keep learning more, just basically building more vocabulary and just practice more to become better, going into intermediate level. But I guess the beginner level is really difficult in any language. If you can't say anything, if you don't have the vocabulary, you just can't say anything, pretty much.
That's absolutely.
Yeah. I guess that's why it's a very good way to start learning a language intensively. And then maybe later on, you can slow down your pace a little bit and, you can still keep going. Otherwise, if you go slowly, it takes a long time for you to even make a basic communication with people, and that may discourage you, and then you may give up, isn't it?
It's a good point you raised about reaching certain levels. Actually, I think for me, on the road to learning Chinese, there have been a couple of those. I think one obvious level you want to reach is being able to have a basic conversation with people. That's really helpful because once you're able to do that, and especially if you're in China or in a Chinese speaking environment, people are going to be really receptive. People are going to be really supportive of you speaking Chinese. So you will have a lot of opportunities to apply and practice the Chinese But that's just one level. And I think it's a trap that a lot of foreigners studying Chinese get stuck in, because once you're able to converse relatively fluently with people, people are going to be like, oh, wow, your Chinese is really great, And a lot of your conversations are going to evolve around the same topics. So you kind of stay in one point. It's really important to keep pushing on past that point. I mean, if simple conversation is your goal, that's fair enough. But if you want to get past that, you really need to keep pushing, because people will tell you, wow, your Chinese is great. We talk, you understand what I'm saying. We can have basic conversations. And Chinese people, usually when they meet foreigners, they don't really have a high expectation. So like when you can have a basic conversation, people are already like blown away, like, wow, your Chinese is so great.
Yeah.
You really gotta keep pushing past that. And I think one important point for me was, once you kind of got the Baihua, the standard spoken language down, is getting into written Chinese. So what I found after a year of intensive study back in Germany, after that, I went to Taiwan, to Taipei, for another year of intensive Chinese study. And after about a semester there, I had the daily conversations down pretty well, including some, more complicated topics maybe. But one thing I noticed is, looking at a newspaper, I had no idea what was going on, because written Chinese language is actually quite different from spoken Chinese. And this is something that many Chinese people aren't even aware of, because Chinese people are used to, written Chinese, the more written style from elementary school. But if you're studying Chinese as a foreigner, they only really teach you the spoken Chinese at first, and the written style comes in later. So if you really want to push your Chinese to a next level, past the conversation, you got to get into that written Chinese. What I found really useful is in university, we had some classical Chinese courses. And at first I was like, why would I want to study classical Chinese? But a semester or so in, I realized, wow, this is actually really useful because a lot of the written Chinese style comes from classical Chinese. So once you're able to, like confidently read a newspaper, it's much easier to advance because obviously you want something interesting to keep you stimulated, and you want to make learning a language something natural. So if you can read a newspaper or you can read a book and you actually enjoy the content, it's much easier to learn the language rather than saying, I have to learn this list of vocabulary. And this is kind of where you want to get.
Right. So once you graduated from university in Chinese, you went to Taiwan to take the intensive course. At what level were your Chinese when you went to Taiwan?
No, actually, when I went to Taiwan, that was in my second year of university. That was an exchange.
Oh,
so
right.
First year of university, we had the intensive Chinese class, and that brought us up to like maybe HSK 4, maybe a little bit
Right.
beyond. And we had to study both traditional and simplified characters.
Wow.
So I figured, like I can extend on the traditional characters a little bit, go to Taiwan, and the simplified will be easier to learn later.
Yes.
Which a lot of people have confirmed. If you start studying only simplified, you can do that. It's a little bit easier, but getting into traditional will be hard. And I think people underrate the beauty of traditional characters. I'm really, really happy that I started studying Chinese with traditional characters because it's an important part of Chinese culture. They make a lot more sense. If you're studying characters, it's nice to see, like what the components are, what the radicals are, what they mean, what's the history behind the character. And a lot of that is lost in simplified characters. So I think that's kind of a shame. And I highly encourage Chinese learners to take into consideration studying traditional characters. It's not as difficult as it looks, and it's really an enriching part to, studying about Chinese language and culture.
Yeah, I think you have raised a very, very good point because I personally do agree with you in terms of traditional character because Chinese character is in an image form and, the image itself represents the meaning of the character. So that's the beauty of the language. And well, the chairman Mao made the decision to simplify all the traditional character into simplified character. And for the purpose of being able to write faster, being more efficient. But then that definitely damaged some of the meaning, some of the meaning get lost during the process. So traditional character is definitely, I personally would definitely recommend people to learn the traditional language because that's the original language and the real beauty lies in it. If you are fascinated by the Chinese characters, then definitely learn the traditional character. But however, from a usage point of view, right, all the mainland Chinese use simplified characters, whereas Hong Kong and Taiwan, and maybe for people from Southeast Asia, they use traditional characters. Like, for example, Malaysian Chinese, Singaporean Chinese, those people, they use traditional Chinese characters. I personally grew up learning simplified Chinese. I can read traditional Chinese characters, but I can't write them. So that's what happens. Well, I guess most of the Chinese from mainland China can write simplified Chinese and can read traditional Chinese, but they can't write traditional Chinese.
Yeah. I'm really happy when I'm in mainland China and I see traditional Chinese characters on advertisements or something like that. Because it's true, most people can read them. And I think it's nice to have them present because they're just so beautiful to look at.
Yeah, I agree. Well, now let's move on. In terms of your learning methods, so what's been the method that's been working for you? Well, you have learned 7 languages. You definitely have a love in learning language. So what's been the most effective technique or method that's been working for you?
Well, for me, I think it's all about immersion and feeling the language. I think if you study a language just for the sake of studying, you're not going to really get into it. For example, growing up in Germany, I studied English and French from first grade, and I really enjoyed English because as a kid, you come across English in video games or movies,
Right.
like there's a natural attraction to the language. Whereas French, I was always like, yeah. And the same was true for most of my classmates. So French was kind of like, yeah, the language everyone had studied for years, but was never really good at. And that changed for me in my teens when I traveled to France frequently, and I really like surfing. So that's kind of where it started. I went to France to surf, and I went back a couple of times and did some summer camps in France, and there I had an opportunity to speak with French people, and I got into some French music. So there was kind of like something that I enjoyed about French, and that got
Mhm.
me into studying the language. And while I was living in Thailand, I studied Thai and I tried my best to speak Thai every day. And that was good. It was part of my life. Whereas, for example, and for Chinese too, Chinese, especially while I was living in Taiwan, I really got into a lot of Taiwanese bands that I enjoyed and watched some Taiwanese movies. And that really helped me progress because I enjoyed those things. So I would also take some songs that I enjoyed and play them on the guitar and sing and, like learn the lyrics by heart. And for me, this was a very natural way to learn the language. And this is like where I could really see I progressed. Also, I lived with
Mhm.
Taiwanese roommates and we played mahjong together, and I would speak Chinese with them. Chinese just became a very natural part of my life. And I think that's really part and parcel when it comes to studying languages. And it's not because I mean, I worked hard to study Chinese, but many people are, and it doesn't always yield the same results because I think you really need to immerse, you need to be passionate about it in some way.
Mhm.
To give you an example, during my master's in Xiamen, I took a Korean class for 2 semesters, but I didn't have any Korean friends in Xiamen, or I wasn't really into any Korean shows. I just kind of thought it was a cool language. But that way, it was only something I studied. It was not something that I lived. And so after 2 semesters, my Korean was still very, very, very basic.
Right.
I didn't make much progress at all because I wasn't like into it with my heart. So if there's any recommendation to learning languages, from my experience, it's really that you have to get your heart into it. You have to make it a part of your life. You gotta make it part of things. You gotta be passionate about things in that language, be it music, books. Yeah.
Right. Well, you mentioned you learned 150 characters in a week when you were studying in university. Well, can you share with us a bit about your technique in memorizing those 150 characters? That's a difficult task to, maintain. If you can memorize 150 characters a week for a year, you have memorized 7,800 characters, which is amazing. So how have you been memorizing those characters?
Just to be clear, it wasn't 150 characters every single week. We did have like semester holidays or
Sure.
exam period when when we didn't have to
Yep.
learn characters. I think at the end of the year might have been effectively at 3,000 maybe.
Sure. Yep.
But actually, there was a lot of discussion about this in my class because obviously we were all faced with this really difficult task, and it was particularly hard at first when
Hmm.
Chinese characters are completely strange to you. And I've had a lot of classmates, like we'd get our homework and, that day we'd have 20 new characters and they would take each of those 20 new characters and write them like 500 times, which is really time consuming.
Yeah.
And they weren't necessary. And from what I noticed from my classmates who did that, they didn't necessarily remember the characters any better, even though they wrote them so many times. Me personally, I was never into the writing too much. What I always did, there's this software called Wenlin, Wenlin, like character forest. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Wenlin, I get it. Character forest. Interesting.
It's a really simple piece of software. It's like a Chinese character dictionary. And in there you can look up the characters and it'll tell you exactly how the character comes about. So for example, if you have a character that has the radical yen, as in speech, and some other, phonetic component, it'll tell you, this character is written that way because it has to do with speech, and there's also a phonetic component because it kind of sounds like this and that. So yeah,
Right.
so it'll give you the explanations as to what's the phonetic part of the character, what's the semantic part, or if it's a pictographic character, what it's supposed to look like, and then what I always did was just like really study how does that character come about. Thinking about it, there's also a really good website called Yellowbridge. Yellowbridge.com. They have a dictionary.
Right.
And if you look up characters there, you can look up the etymology, I think it's called. Anyway, the story of how the character comes about.
Right.
I think Wenlin, the software is a little bit better, but Yellowbridge also does like nice explanations of how the characters come about. And I found that really helpful, kind of when it makes click and you're like, oh, this is really nice. This is like really interesting how they came up with that character. Or sometimes it doesn't even make sense. So you have to make up your own stories. Like, how does that radical match with that part of the character?
Right.
And you just make yourself those kind of memory aids. And I usually spend quite a few minutes for each character, just like, thinking about how it's composed and how these components match. And then I would write it maybe, a dozen or 24 times, but not too many. And,
right.
Then just repeat.
That's a good method. So basically you look up a character to understand the story behind the character, break it down into parts, and then try to make connections of those parts with the story behind the character. And then that way, it's a much better way to memorize the character rather than just keep on repeating, just write it 100 times, isn't it?
Exactly. That's how I felt anyway. I think different things might work for different people, but I found that very helpful and also more fun, because you kind of have to use your imagination.
Yeah.
Some characters have a story behind them that's really interesting. Some characters don't, and you kind of have to make up your own story. But, you kind of use your imagination, and it makes it a lot easier to remember.
Yes, that's the key to memory, imagination, and relating something to it.
Yeah.
So that way you can memorize things easier. Well, in terms of listening and speaking, how did you learn those? How did you practice your pronunciation?
Pronunciation is a good point. I remember before we started our intensive class, we had a week, I think it was a week, on like just pronunciations of just phonetics in the Chinese language that foreigners need to watch out for. Like certain tones that people often get wrong, like the zh. You'd have to practice these, and the teacher would explain, like, how do you make that sound, and everyone would have to try it. And they paid a lot of attention to this, which is, I guess, kind of a luxury. You can't do that in a regular language school because people are going to be bored as hell. They want to learn to speak their first sentences. But I think it's a really necessary step, and I was quite grateful that our program did that, because you first you need to get the basics right, and then you start with memorizing words and characters.
Right.
So I think that was really helpful for pronunciation.
Right, cool. So did you just learn it from your teacher at school, or did you listen to some audio and practice and repeat?
Oh, for sure. I mean, during our first year, we had a book that our university had developed with the Mandarin Training Center of Taiwan National Normal University. So they had a CD and they had audio examples, and so we listened to those. This is, I think, but I think most Chinese textbooks will have something like this, some kind of listening, speaking practice. At a later stage, it's definitely important to find yourself some cultural input. Listen if there's any Chinese bands that you like, or any kind of musicians, or watch Chinese movies. Even with subtitles, you'll still hear the language. Just find something that's fun to listen to.
Yes, great point. During your study of Chinese, what have been your biggest challenge in learning Chinese, and how did you overcome it?
Well, there's a couple, I guess. Well, I think there's 4 parts to studying Chinese. One is listening, speaking, reading, writing. And among these, writing is definitely the toughest to get down, because once you've learned a character, you're probably not going to forget how to read it,
Hmm.
but you'll very easily forget how to write it. So it's like the
That's true.
difference between passive knowledge and active knowledge of the character. And this
Hmm.
happens to Chinese people too. In university in China, I had a lot of teachers standing in front of class, writing a very basic character and like asking the class, "Oh, how does this character? How do you write this character again?" Because nowadays it's all about practice, and especially nowadays we use our phones, we use computers to write. People don't write by hand so much
Hmm.
anymore, and it's
That's
really
true.
easy to forget how to write correctly. And it,
Yes.
it was very reassuring for me to see that this even happens to Chinese people.
Happens to me.
The only recipe is practice. So when I had a test
Yes.
coming up in university here in China, and it was a written test, what I would do is like a couple of weeks or a month before, I would start writing every day, writing small essays, and the characters will come back. But the
Hmm.
writing is definitely toughest to maintain, and it still is up to this day.
Yes, definitely. So if you are to start learning Chinese from scratch all over again, how would you do it?
I think I was quite happy with starting out with an intensive course, and this is what I would recommend to most people. If you're committed to studying Chinese, sign up for a language course in China, take a semester or 2 semesters to come to China to a language program at a good university and go all in. That would be my
Mhm.
recommendation, especially in the beginning, because it's not a language that you can pick up if you do in the evening class once a week. That's my opinion.
Right. Now, please share with us an embarrassing or a funny moment in learning Chinese.
Geez, there must be a bunch of those. I remember once I was participating at the Hanyuqiao competition in 2014,
Hmm.
and it was past the pre-round. There was 30 of us, and we had a challenge where we had to go to those bronze soldiers, and they would ask us a Chinese question, and we'd have to answer to get like
Right.
a clue to finish this challenge. And this
Right.
one guy asked a question, 的下一句是什么?
Right.
So which is a reference to a Chinese poem that like
Yes.
all Chinese kids learn in elementary school
Yes.
about geese, and
Yes.
it's like goose 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 stretching out its neck into the sky.
Yep. Yep.
And I was just very confused because I'd never heard the poem before. So I was like, oh, three maybe it's another. So I was like, is the next one. So that was one of my embarrassing Chinese moments. And it was actually caught on camera and broadcast for millions of people to see.
That's funny. What's the reaction of other people?
There was like the bronze soldier. He was just like, he just looked really confused. Like, that's what I said.
Right.
You're supposed to tell me the next sentence.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty funny. Well, now please share with us a success story, a most rewarding moment after you have become fluent in Chinese.
Oh, that's a nice one. Yeah, actually, I remember one time I was on a train to Haikou. I was taking like a sleeper train. I love the old sleeper trains in China, like the
Right.
uh, the ones with 30 beds in a car.
Yes.
Um, and I was staying in one of those, and they'd already turned off the lights.
Hmm.
And then I was on a top bunk, and there was a young lady on the other bunk on the other side.
Hmm.
And she asked me something practical about the luggage or something. I don't know what it was. Anyway, we got into talking, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm from Haikou, and like where you going?" And like we had a little chat for
Hmm.
5 minutes. So, and then she was like, "So where are you from?" And I was like, "I'm from Germany." And she's like,
Hmm.
well, "You're a foreigner?"
Wow.
And I was really flattered because she thought I was a Chinese all the time. So I think
Wow.
that's what you dream of when you start learning Chinese. That at one point people take you
Nice.
for a Chinese.
So lights were off and you were chatting in the dark.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wow. That's definitely very rewarding. That's awesome.
That was a nice moment.
Yeah, definitely. So what are you doing with your Chinese now?
I use Chinese every day at work. A lot of my coworkers are Chinese. and I use it for research. We do a lot of market analysis, so it's handy to do primary research in Chinese.
Hmm.
And it's actually a very useful skill at my work because we do a lot of market research for our German partners, and a lot of the data isn't available in English. So
Hmm.
the Chinese comes in really handy there.
Hmm.
And then, of course, in everyday life, since I'm living in China, be it to
Yes.
get my food delivery or talk to people on the street, it is
Yep.
China. So you get to use Chinese.
Awesome. Yeah, using your Chinese to the fullest extent, I guess.
I try.
So, how would you compare your life before you've learned Chinese and your life after you've learned Chinese?
I always thought Chinese as a key to a door that opens a very large part of the world. I think this is, and to a very large community,
Hmm.
because the Chinese community, I mean, China is a huge country with a lot of people, and to foreigners who haven't been to China before, it's mind-blowing to see the scale and just how big a country China is and how much there's happening. Anyway, for me, I had that experience when I first came.
Mm.
But it's not just that. There's a huge Chinese community in most countries. I was living in Toronto for a year during university as well, and there's a huge Chinese community there. And speaking Chinese as a foreigner, people are really happy. Like it's like
Hmm.
you're part of the community, and you get some of the references. There's some kind of cultural bond,
Mm.
and that's a really beautiful thing to share with such a much larger part of the world. The world just becomes more of a home, I feel.
Hmm. Yes, definitely. So once you know the language, you're also connected with the people and you get to really join in, really become part of the culture, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
So, what's your favorite city in China? Obviously, I guess you enjoy traveling, isn't it?
Yes, I do.
You have traveled to a lot of places,
Well, I'm a big fan of Xiamen. I'm biased, but Xiamen is a great town.
right?
I really love it. Guangzhou is nice too. It's a lot bigger. I personally, for me, I'm a nature guy. I
Hmm.
like it quiet sometimes, which you don't get as
Hmm.
much in Guangzhou. But as far as first tier cities go, I'm a big fan
Hmm.
of Guangzhou. It's a pretty nice place. Also, good location. It's really good to get out into the mountains. I really like hiking.
Right.
So Guangzhou is good for that, and people are very nice. But if I'm gonna have to pick a favorite, it's probably gonna be Xiamen
Why?
because Xiamen is it's a good size. It's not too big, not too small.
Hmm.
It's a very developed city. Also, it's a very cultural city. There's a lot of live houses, a lot of bands, a lot of artists, very, very live cultural scene,
Mm.
and lots of nice cafes. It's got nice mountains. It's got beaches. So,
Mm.
yeah, Xiamen is the full package.
Awesome. Well, now I guess it's a chance to ask you about your travel from Singapore to Germany.
Uh-huh.
How did you do that?
It was after I had studied in Taiwan. I thought like, why not be creative? I still had semester holidays, so I was like, why not be creative on how to get back to Germany?
Right.
And it was really cheap to fly to Singapore, so I was like, I'm just gonna start my trip in Singapore. Traveled through Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, made a little stopover to visit old friends. Then went into Laos, which is a great country. Highly recommend visiting.
Hmm.
From Laos into Yunnan, to which I
Hmm.
hadn't been to before. Also very beautiful province, very original, very
Right.
natural.
Hmm.
And and I went into like Shangri-La and the Yunnan
Hmm.
part of Tibet,
Yep.
which foreigners are allowed to travel to, and from there into the Sichuan part of Tibet, which was
Hmm.
also really nice. Tagong. There's a town called Tagong. It's like a little bit to the west of Kangding. The Kangding is like they got this famous love song, Kangding love song,
Yes.
Western
Yes.
city, and it's
Hmm.
close to there. That was a town I was really, well, not the town itself, but outside the town, you can
Hmm.
see a really high 7,000 plus meter peak from there. And it's very natural. It's Tibetan culture. And I went on a homestay with a Tibetan family, and I had to hike there for 4 hours.
Wow.
And I kind of got
Wow.
lost on the hike, and in the middle of nowhere. It was just like
Wow.
fields and plain fields, and but it was beautiful. I was very, very impressed. I'm a big fan of West China, for
Hmm.
sure, and that place is
Yeah.
probably on the top of my list. And from there, I went to Chengdu, Chengdu to Xi'an, and Xi'an to Urumqi.
Wow.
Stayed in Urumqi for a bit, and then into Kazakhstan. And from Kazakhstan, from Almaty, I took a 3-day train to Moscow, from Moscow into Ukraine, and from Ukraine to Berlin, and then Berlin to my
Wow.
hometown. And whole thing took about 6 weeks. It was a good trip.
Yeah. Sounds like fun. That's pretty awesome.
It was exhausting actually.
Right.
Probably it was very, very interesting, and I took a lot of memories from it. But I was thinking, because I mean, like, the trip is one thing, but there's also a lot of logistics you have to take care of. You have to get your visas,
Hmm.
and that
Yes.
you run into some trouble. And I was traveling by myself. I was thinking, if I'm gonna do a trip like this again, I would probably do it with a friend, because
Right.
that way two people can shoulder the stress, and you're not just
Yeah.
on your own. But it was definitely a very good experience.
Did you do your research beforehand, or you just traveled and decide where to go next the day before?
Kind of in between. I had like a rough plan sketched out, but
Right.
I always kept myself some liberty to make decisions and adjustments on the go.
Well, it's interesting to know, like, how would you compare some neighboring countries of China compared to China? How does those, like Laos, Thailand, Kazakhstan, like how those countries compare to China?
Wow, it really depends. I think no country compares to China, or to each other for that matter. They're all very unique places.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think they're different each is different from China in its own way. It would be very
Yes.
hard to. Laos is a lot slower, a lot more laid back. Laos doesn't have any big cities. Vientiane, the capital, is like the biggest city, but it doesn't have any high-rise buildings, not a
Hmm.
lot of cars. Definitely very different vibe from China.
Right.
Kazakhstan is pretty much European. I mean, like,
Hmm.
it feels very European. The shops, the cities. Also, there's a lot of Caucasian people. So yeah, I wouldn't know where to start. Finding the
Mm.
differences. There's just too many.
Awesome. Definitely worth visiting all of them to see the difference.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Well, is there a tool, an app, or a website that you cannot live without in learning Chinese?
I think the two I mentioned before, Wenlin, the software, and
Yep.
Yellow Bridge, were probably my most helpful
Sure.
for me. I didn't use many smartphone apps. Pleco is pretty popular, and it's a good
Hmm.
dictionary. I guess it also has flashcard features and stuff.
Right. Cool. So if you are to recommend to our listeners one book in learning Chinese or the Chinese culture, what would that be?
Well, personally, I recently read a Chinese novel that I really enjoyed called Three Body Problem. It's a sci-fi novel, the first Chinese sci-fi novel that's become internationally well known,
Right.
by Liu Cixin. It doesn't have so much to do with Chinese culture, I guess, because it's not really about China in the first place, but it's a very enjoyable Chinese novel that I've read. Something else that comes to my mind is an American author who's half Chinese, whose books I really enjoyed reading, called Lisa C. She wrote a book, Shanghai Girls, which sounds like a really girly book, but it's cool. It's very cool.
Right.
About two sisters who have to flee Japan during World War II and then go to the States and kind of start a new life there. And then that book has a sequel called Dreams of Joy, about the daughter of one of the sisters who goes to China in the late 50s during the Great Leap Forward. And then it kind of tells her story. And that's really amazing too.
Right.
So I really enjoyed those Lisa C books.
Nice. That's interesting. So she has two books. One is Shanghai Girls, and then there's another one which is Dreams of Joy, is it?
Those two books, Dreams of Joy is a sequel to Shanghai Girls. Those books belong together, but she has a lot of books about Chinese culture.
Right.
Actually, most of her books deal with China in some way.
Cool. I'll link that in the show note. Well, now this is your chance to teach our listeners your favorite Chinese quote, phrase, or expression.
Okay. I really like, the middle way. One thing I appreciate about Chinese culture is the ability to 包容, which is like to accept, to integrate different points of views, people's dialecticism. And there's one saying that I quite like, which is 过犹不及.
过犹不及, yep.
过犹不及. That means too little or too much, neither is good. Just kind of keep it center, keep it the middle way.
Yes, that's a nice quote.
You could use it, for example, if no, you wouldn't say it if you're ordering a milk tea, but just to give an example, like the guy asks you, you want a little sugar or do you want a lot of sugar? You could say 过犹不及, just like
wow,
middle sugar, right?
Yeah.
You'd be really pretentious if you said that while ordering a milk tea, but you get the point.
Yeah. The waiter will be in shock if he hear that.
He'll be words.
Yeah.
He'll forget to take your.
Yeah, no, too impressed. Big word. Awesome. So now, if you are to give our listeners one single piece of parting advice, what would that be?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think there's two key points you have to pay attention to while learning Chinese. One is commit all the way, commit time to studying Chinese. Either you're all in or you're out. I think you really need to set aside half a year or a year, ideally a year, like where you can fully immerse into Chinese culture and Chinese language. Come to China, do a language course here, really commit to studying the language. That's one point. And also really try to find the parts of contemporary or ancient Chinese culture that you really enjoy, that you genuinely enjoy. Look what kind of musicians, what kind of artists you like, what kind of Chinese music you like, what kind of Chinese movies you like, what comics books or books you like. Really spend time looking for that stuff and then get into it, because that's going to help you more than anything. And of course, also hang out with cool Chinese people that you enjoy hanging out with. It's all about enjoying speaking and listening to people.
Great advice. Well, Andreas, just before we let you go, how can our listeners reach you?
You can reach me, I guess, via LinkedIn. That's how you reach me.
Yes.
So,
sure, I'll link that in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Andreas, for sharing with us your journey in learning Chinese. It's been truly an amazing journey. And, thank you so much for letting our listeners to know your method, and your travel. It's just been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
To our listeners, the show note is now available at ChineseTalkEase.com/26. TalkEase is spelled as TALKEZE. Do you want to learn Chinese for free? Start your own journey to Chinese fluency with my video lessons at ChineseTalkEase.com. TalkEase is spelled as TALKEZE. Also remember to join our Facebook group. Just head over to TalkChineseCommunity.com. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. Each month, I will choose one reviewer and give out a 1-year subscription to all my premium video lessons for free. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next episode.